Hi, I'm Ira Lipson. Welcome to the Beatles, the days in their life. Music. It's defined as a significant arrangement of sounds, conceived as an expression of beauty, the communication of an idea, and sometimes as an instrument of social change. The 1960s produced many changes in tastes, in styles, and in social attitudes. It was a period of artistic upheaval and inspired work. Some people, either through luck or circumstance, became the catalysts. And one of the strongest forces that came out of the 60s was a musical group from Liverpool, England, called
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you and buy me love.
Every few months, a musical group comes along and is promoted as the New Beatles. It hasn't worked. Never in the history of popular music has there been a force like the Beatles. Their magic is such that people want to know all about their music and how each song was conceived, written, and performed. So, in this series on the Beatles, we'll follow all of their recorded work using original British pressings in chronological order from their release dates. Here is the most complete radio program ever done on the Beatles.
Tell me why you cry.
You'll relive Beatlemania.
But I think the whole bit really started when we did a Palladium show. And then later we were asked to do the Royal Variety, and we met the Queen Mother, and she started clapping.
And Princess Margaret, too.
Yeah, and Princess Margaret.
Well, I don't know, but I should imagine we'd do She Loves You. Jolly good.
The people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewellery.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
When Mrs. Sullivan and I saw hundreds and hundreds of youngsters, I asked what celebrity was arriving. And they told us the teenagers were awaiting the Beatles.
Going over at that particular moment for those two Ed Sullivan shows could not have been more right.
It's mass hypnosis, Jack. As soon as they do something, the Beatles, anything, you notice how the reaction is?
They're skinny little guys. You can't weigh 130 pounds.
I want a Beatles for Christmas. We want the Beatles!
Well, what's happening, babe? The Beatles and Murray the Cave.
We put the name the Beatles right across the sock because we think that the girls in America are going to want to be associated with them.
We've also asked our listeners to bring all of their Beatles paraphernalia and Beatlemania to the station. We have a big bonfire scheduled for August 19th.
I'm gonna tell Aunt Mary about Uncle John. No reply. Help, I need somebody. I'm in love with her.
You'll hear the results of hundreds of interviews. You'll hear their voices in every phase of their career.
And we did one talent show thing, which we were called Johnny and the Moondogs, which was really just John standing at the front with no guitar singing, with Paul and I just playing guitars at the back doing ba-ba-ba.
We used to try and get them in to sell beer. And we used to, the minute you saw some, we'd all go, dance in the streets. Dance in the streets tonight. And we'd pretend we hadn't seen them, and we'd rock out. And you'd find we got 3 of them in.
Brian Epstein phoned me up and said, would you like to join the Beatles, you know?
And it's me going, cranberry sauce, cranberry sauce. So that's what it says.
Usually 9 times out of 10, Ringo and I haven't heard of the song before. We get in the studio and just try all different arrangements, and we all stick in little bits here and there, you know.
You know, these kind of things, you can't really talk about how they come, because they just come into your head.
But Paul McCartney couldn't die without the world knowing it.
I don't know, it just came out. We went to do a job, you know, and we worked all day, and we happened to work all night, and I came out still thinking it was day, I suppose, and said, it's been a hard day. Looked around, it was dark, and said night.
Yoko was having an art exhibition at a gallery in London, and I used to go to the gallery occasionally to see what was happening.
He's a real nowhere man.
You'll hear from the people who helped make them household names around the world. Their manager, Brian Epstein.
I encouraged them at first to get out of leather jackets and jeans.
Their record producer, George Martin.
I mean, the Beatles were always looking for new sounds, and they were always looking to a new horizon.
You'll hear from their friends. The man who taught them how to play guitar, Jim Geddy.
I used to teach every Monday night in a little shop just along the road in Whitechapel.
Bill Harry, editor of Mersey Beat newspaper.
I encouraged John to write as well, and he had his own column called Beat Coma, with all his what we call wacky writings.
Liz Hughes, one of their original Cavern fans.
You got to the bottom and you were in a basement, a cellar, stone walls, no decor to speak of at all, a very smelly, dingy little place that was always very damp.
Look at all the lovely people, paperback writer. Penny Lane, there is a barber showing photographs. Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to.
You'll hear how each song was written.
Because, for instance, on Hey Jude, I told George not to play guitar.
I just opened a book that was around. I just opened it, and the first thing I looked at became the song, and it was something about Gently Weeps.
I mean, I remember on Obla D, for example, Obla D, Obla Da, I remember Paul coming along with this kind of ska thing, and John actually wasn't in the studio, and we got the thing more or less together, and we were having a bit of a difficulty with it, and he comes in, slightly stoned, and says, "What's this rubbish you're doing?" That goes over to the Barrel House piano and says, "All right, then, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Back in the U.S., back in the USS. Something in the way she moves come together right now.
We hope you'll follow us through the life of one of the most prolific and emulated groups ever. 4 musicians who had a dramatic effect on the directions taken by others. A group that inspired and redefined the boundaries of contemporary music. The Beatles.
And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make.
Liverpool, England. Crossing the Mersey River today is quite different from those noisy days back in the mid-50s. Then it was an industrial seaport where large ocean liners were being built, and it served as a port of call for ships from around the world. And over there, well, the city was dull, damp, and dirty. Not the creative environment you would expect to inspire the world's most influential pop group. It was largely a working-class city, raising a generation not content to finish its education and take the traditional jobs. They wanted their freedom and independence now. And it showed in the way they acted and in the way they dressed. They wore their British tough boy clothes of the day, known as the teddy boy look. Crepe sole or winkle picker shoes, drainpipe pants, long draped jackets, and slim Jim ties. Their hair was long and greased back in the Elvis Little Richard style. And they were drawn to the aggressiveness of rock and roll, a lot of which was brought into Liverpool by the ships from America. One of those disaffected teenagers growing up in Liverpool was John Winston Lennon. Born during a heavy air raid on October 9, 1940, John's parents separated when he was a baby. So his aunt, Mimi Smith, became his guardian, though his mom, Julia, came to see him often. She was happy and carefree, and a big influence on John. She was the complete opposite to Mimi, the disciplinarian. As with everything, John had to be the leader, whether on the street in gangs or later when he formed his first musical group. His interest in music began while listening to various pop shows on the BBC. The first records he liked were such things as Johnny Ray's
If your sweetheart sends a letter of goodbye,
The Crew Cuts,
shaboom, shaboom, ya-da-da-da-da-da-da, shaboom, shaboom.
and even Hank Snow.
I told you, baby, from time to time, but you just wouldn't listen. No pain in no mind, now I'm moving on.
But he didn't take notice until he heard
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags
Bill Haley and the Comets doing Rock Around the Clock.
when the clock strikes 1. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
Another big influence on John was a style of pop music that was very big in Britain at the time, and in which everyone was getting involved. It was called skiffle, and its first star was Lonnie Donegan.
Well, about the time of rock and roll in Britain, I think I was about 15, so it'd be 1955. There was a big thing called skiffle, which was a kind of folk music, American folk music, and it's sort of jing 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 with washboards. And all the kids, 15 onwards, used to have these groups, and I formed one at school.
But probably the most exciting event to affect John Lennon was the appearance of Elvis Presley.
Well, since my baby left me, well, I found a new place to dwell. Well, it's down at the end of Lonely Street, that heartbreak hotel where I'll be just so lonely, baby. Well, I'm so lonely.
John has said that when he heard Elvis for the first time, he thought, this is it.
Although it's always crowded, you still can find some room for broken-hearted lovers to cry there in the gloom. Be so, well, be so lonely.
At school, John was far from perfect. His headmaster explains.
I was certainly very interested in him. To me, of course, he was an acute problem to all my colleagues.
He received his first guitar from his mother. He tried to learn some basic chords, but as with most things, he became frustrated and had his mother teach him. But she showed him banjo chords because that's all she could play. Back home, Aunt Mimi wouldn't go for John's guitar playing. Constantly, she would tell him,
The guitar's all right for a hobby, but it won't earn you any money.
John and his friend Pete Shotton formed their first group, the Quarrymen, in early 1956, named after the school they attended, Quarry Bank Grammar School. It was supposed to be a skiffle group, but more and more rock and roll kept creeping into their repertoire. One day, a friend of John's, Ivan Vaughn, told a classmate about their band. His friend was fairly accomplished on guitar and, of course, loved rock and skiffle as much as they did. His name was Paul McCartney, born on June 18, 1942. Paul was always musically inclined. His first instrument was the trumpet.
My dad bought me a trumpet, and I tried to play trumpet and learned the Saints and a couple of things. But my lip was going funny, and I realized I wouldn't be able to sing while I was playing the trumpet. I liked singing, so I traded that in for a guitar, which was a right-handed one. I couldn't work out how I couldn't play it, so I turned it like the right way, and amazingly, upon amazing, it felt good, and I was strumming with the right hand now, the correct hand.
On June 15, 1956, he went with Ivan to see the Quarrymen perform at an outdoor party at the Woolton Parish Church. When he heard them, Paul was impressed, though he laughed at all the mistakes they were making. John was singing the Dell Vikings' Come Go With Me, but he didn't know the words, so he was making them up. After the performance, Paul went back to see them. He showed them a couple of numbers that he had just learned himself. One was 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran.
Ooh, well, I gotta get with a record machine. When it comes to rockin', she's a queen. We love to dance on a Saturday night. All alone where I can hold her tight, but she lives on the 20th floor uptown. The elevator's broken down, so
John played some new pieces that he knew, and then Paul came back with a song he had written himself. At that moment, both of them probably realized their potential, even if John was a bit tipsy from all the beer he'd been drinking. To John, the next step was obvious, to have Paul join the group. He thought that Paul was a great guitarist, but knew that he'd have to watch him because he was the kingpin. John knew that Paul was too good not to have in the band. The next day, Ivan saw Paul bicycling up in Woolton and asked him if he'd like to be in the band. Paul said yes, and so one of the greatest musical partnerships began.
well, it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you step on my blue suede shoe. You can do anything but lay off of my blue suede shoe.
When Paul joined, he played lead guitar, but at his first performance with him, he blew his big guitar solo, and this seemed to level things off for John. He could see, however, that Paul was more musically advanced and was always a couple of chords ahead. Paul wanted to perform some songs that he had written, so John, not to be outdone, immediately began to compose his own tunes. Their early material wasn't much, really, very simple and similar to songs of the day. But what was important was the effect they had on each other. From this point on, they never stopped.
We used to just sag off school together and kind of go back to my house, and where there wasn't anyone in the afternoons, and we'd go there and smoke Twining's tea in a pipe, one of my dad's pipes, and it didn't taste bad at all, actually. And, we'd sit around smoking that stuff and have a little bang on the piano. We had a stand-up piano by then, and we had guitars, and it was mainly kind of Buddy Holly stuff, because he had the least chords.
Oh, the little things you say and do make me want to be with you. Raymond, it's a crazy feeling, and I know it's got me reeling when you say I love you, Raymond.
On the daily hour-long bus ride to and from the Liverpool Institute, Paul met a younger student named George Harrison. They talked about school and other things, but mostly about music, rock and roll, skiffle, and especially Elvis. George was born in the middle of the war on February 25th, 1943. He was never really interested in school, and his rebellious nature came out first in his unorthodox clothes. He found a creative outlet in playing the guitar.
56, I think, was when I first got a guitar. That was the same time I met Paul McCartney in school, who I found out because he used to live near me. I used to meet him because we used to take the same bus ride home. And after hanging out with him, I found his father used to have a little band, you see, so there was a bit of music in his family, so he had a trumpet, and so we used to just hang out and try and play when the Saints go marching in.
In 1956, when George was 13, he formed his own group called the Rebels, but it lasted only for a short time. He sat in occasionally with other groups until Paul, his friend at school, asked him to join the Quarrymen in 1958. At first, John was opposed to George's joining because he was so much younger than the rest. But when John asked him to play Bill Justice's Raunchy, he knocked him out with his playing, and so George was in. About this time, the skiffle boom was on the wane, and the boys were down to playing just rock and roll. The members were constantly changing because they couldn't take John's attitude, or they felt left out. George, Paul, and John. It was now their band. One of their first big engagements of this new combination was at the Casbah Club in Liverpool. And at this point, they changed their name to Johnny and the Moondogs.
We did one talent show thing, which we were called Johnny and the Moondogs, which was really just John standing at the front with no guitar singing, with Paul and I just playing guitars at the back doing ba-ba-ba.
John and Paul actually appeared briefly as a duo at this time, calling themselves the Nurk Twins.
Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music.
By now, John Lennon was at the Liverpool Art College, specializing in lettering. He had left home and was living in a flat near the college with a fellow student, Stuart Sutcliffe. John and Stu had a mutual admiration for each other. John admired Stuart's great artistic abilities, and Stuart was impressed with John's band, who played at the college at lunchtime. When Stuart sold a painting for £60 at an art exhibition, John convinced him to use the money to buy a bass guitar. Stuart had always wanted to be part of the group instead of just hanging around with them, so here was an opportunity for him to join. Another classmate at the college, Bill Harry, who later started the Merseybeat newspaper, explains.
He managed to get one of his paintings sold at the John Moores exhibition and get the money for the guitar in the first place. And to me it was very strange. He became in love with the Beatles and enraptured by them, wanted to become a member. And yet I knew it was doomed to failure right from the beginning, because he was such a great artist.
There was another problem. Stuart couldn't play his bass guitar, but John said he'd teach him. In photographs of those days, Stewart usually stood with his back to the audience so they couldn't see him fumbling about. It looked as though John, the bass teacher, wasn't doing his job. Or maybe Stewart just wasn't meant to play it. At this time, the band decided to call themselves the Silver Beatles. They had always liked the name Buddy Holly and the Crickets. John especially liked the name the Crickets. The closest thing to it was Beatles.
I was looking for a name like the Crickets that meant two things. And from Crickets I got to Beatles. And I changed the BEA because it didn't mean two things on its own. I changed the E to the A. And it meant two things then. It was beat and Beatles, and when you said it, people thought of Crawley things. And when you read it, it was beat music.
They played off and on for a year or two until Larry Parnes, a big British promoter, came to Liverpool to audition bands to back Billy Fury, a very popular star of the day who was also from Liverpool. Billy and Larry Parnes were impressed with the Silver Beatles, but would give them the job of backing Billy only if they dropped their bass player, Stewart. John, Paul, George, and Stewart were very loyal to one another, so they turned down the offer. But Larry Parnes didn't forget them and offered them a tour of Scotland backing another British artist, Johnny Gentle. Of course, Stewart went along, but he didn't get paid by Parnes.
Well, Bebop-a-Lula, she's my baby. Bebop-a-Lula, I don't mean my baby.
Throughout the next months, the band played various venues with and without drummers. And at one time, they even backed a stripper playing such ditties as It's a Long Way to Tipperary and Summertime. On their days off, they'd go into Hesse's music store and visit Jim Geddy.
You know, they used to come in there, just everyday chaps, you know, you used just get to know, hey, come here, hello, Jim, you know, hello, George, hello, John, you know, and they sat and have a chat. I said, yeah, do you want anything? Oh, just have a look around, Jim, you know, by the way, they pick a guitar up and the way they go, you know, and have a little go and have a little practice. And when they heard about the skiffle, of course, the rock and roll started, and then they all sort of wanted to learn to play the guitar. Hundreds of people wanted to learn the guitar all at once. Of course, I used to teach every Monday night in a little shop just along the road in Whitechapel. And between 6 and 7:30, we had all sorts. We had Jerry, we had Beatles, we had at the foremost, and almost every group, everybody who's been playing, who made the top, you know, they all come for lessons, you know, everybody bought a guitar. They used to give them free lessons. 50, 60, 70 people in one night, you know, learning the basic chords of the guitar. And I used to have a big blackboard and write 6 lines that there were wires and big dots here, and that's the key of so-and-so, that's the key of so-and-so. Now we'll sing a song, and we had the right. Every Monday night it got very, very popular.
Alan Williams, their off and on-again manager, ran a couple of clubs in Liverpool. One day, a Caribbean steel band that played in one of these clubs was offered a lot of money to perform in Hamburg. This intrigued him, so he went to visit Hamburg himself with a tape of some Liverpool bands.
I told him that the groups were the best in England, and that they were very famous groups, and he could have them with tongue-in-cheek in those days, because the Beatles used to be working for £5 a night and £10 a night. I said, it'll cost you £100 a week, plus my commission of £10.
Through this connection, the Beatles were eventually offered a job to play there, but they needed a drummer. Pete Best was the son of the lady who owned the Casbah Club. When it opened, the Quarrymen played there quite often. In August of 1959, Peter began to play the drums. Ken Brown, a former Quarryman, asked if he could form a group with him, and they became the resident band at the club. Eventually, the group disbanded, and in August of 1960, Paul McCartney phoned and asked if Pete would like to join the Beatles for their job in Hamburg. So off to Hamburg went John, Paul, George, Stewart, Pete Best, Alan Williams, his wife Beryl, and their friend and cohort Lord Woodbine, all in Alan Williams' small van. The first Hamburg club that the Beatles played was the Indra, the German name for Indian. At first, they got a cool reception, but gradually their show improved. Their audience went from a group of 5 to the point where they were packing them in, playing 7 nights a week, performing non-stop 8-hour sessions. Quite a change from the 1-hour sets back in Liverpool.
People would appear at the door of the club, and we were on stage and there was nobody at the tables. We used to try and get them in to sell beer to the manager. And we used to, the minute you saw some, we'd all go, dance in the streets, or whatever was one of our big numbers. Dance in the streets is one of them. Dance in the streets tonight, and we'd pretend we hadn't seen them, and we'd rock out. And you'd find we got 3 of them in. And so we were very much trained on this idea of what do they call them, barkers, the fairground almost. You'd see 4 people, and we had to get those 4 people in. And so this knack is like very important, obviously, in showbiz, how to attract those 4 people in to sell 4 bottles of beer for the man who's paying us. We eventually sold the club out, and that, I would say, then we started to know it was going to be big.
After about 2 months, the Indra was closed because of complaints from neighbors about the noise, and they moved to the Kaiser Keller. The Kaiser Keller was a larger club, but with the same tough crowd as the Indra. In this new venue, they had to do alternate hours with another group from Liverpool, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, whose drummer was none other than Richard Starkey, better known later as Ringo Starr. Playing on and off for 12 hours a day to a foreign audience, the Beatles were forced to expand their show from the dozen or so songs they knew in Liverpool to the 100 they needed to compete and last in Hamburg.
We got very good as a band because we had to play 8 hours a night. And we got a big repertoire of some of our own songs, but mainly all the old rock songs. In fact, everything. We used to play Moonglow, but we got very tight as a band, and because it was the period in England when it was all matching ties and handkerchiefs and doing routines like the Shadows, and we were out of it for that, so we just kept playing the rock and roll things and the stuff from records we used to get from Brian Epstein's shop before we met him.
The Beatles didn't have much time to socialize during these Hamburg visits, but one day a few German art students began visiting the Kaiser Keller, and they soon became friends. Klaus Wurman was the first to see them, and he took along Astrid Kirchner and Jürgen Vollmer. They were immediately attracted and could see something special in their show. Astrid was an excellent photographer, and along with Jürgen were the first people to take professional pictures of the band. These pictures in Hamburg are some of the best ever taken of them. It was a style that influenced the visual image of the Beatles in the beginning. When the Beatles found some free time, they often went to see another Liverpool performer at the Top 10 Club, Tony Sheridan. They played together on a few occasions, and eventually the owner, Peter Eckhorn, offered them a contract when their engagement at the Kaiser Keller was over.
We got ourselves together enough for this other manager of another nightclub. He wanted us to work there, and that was the reason we were deported in the first place, because we tried to leave at the end of this engagement and go and work for this other club for more money. And the manager of the original club got a bit uptight and had us all deported.
When he saw that he was losing the Beatles, the authorities forced George to leave the country for being underage. And the day that Paul and Pete Best were moving out of their dingy rooms behind the Bambi Theater, a fire was somehow started, which earned them a ticket home as well. And Stu and John, broke and exhausted, weren't far behind. In an air of despondency, the Beatles returned to Liverpool in early December 1960. After a week or two, they finally got themselves going and played at the Casbah Club. But if anything was to lift their spirits at the time, it was their performance at the Litherland Town Hall, a large suburban Liverpool dance hall. That night, the Beatles exploded in front of their friends. The audience couldn't believe the improvement. These lurching, leaping, leather-clad lads drove them wild.
Thank you. Well, we'd like to sing Twist and Shout.
It was on this night that the first real signs of Beatlemania occurred. On March 21st, 1961, the Beatles make their debut at No. 8 Matthew Street, The Cavern, a warehouse opened in the 1950s as a traditional jazz spot, but now beat groups such as the Swinging Blue Jeans, The Foremost, and Jerry and the Pacemakers shared the stage with the Beatles. Liz Hughes, one of their original Cavern fans who has started the Beatle Museum on Matthew Street, explains what those early days of the Cavern were like.
Matthew Street, back then, was a very dark, sort of dingy little road with 7-storey warehouses all the way down on either side. Very little light, natural light got through. It was always sort of dark and dreary looking, and the cavern door was literally a hole in the wall. It was an arched doorway, sort of painted at the top in red and white and blue, and with the cavern was sort of scrolled up one side. It was originally done by the doorman who worked there, and the stairs sort of went to nothing at one side, so you went down sideways like a crab, you know, with your feet on these stone steps. You got to the bottom and you were in a basement, a cellar. Stone walls, no decor to speak of at all, a very smelly, dingy little place that was always very damp. If you touched the walls, your hands came away wet, because with all the bodies down there, the sweat, the walls used to sweat, the water had run off them. The stage was built into an arch. The groups playing on the stage didn't have a terrific amount of headroom. You usually notice on old cavern photographs that the two fellas standing nearest the wall will always have the heads bent, because the arch was literally touching the top of the head, you know.
In April, after much arranging by Alan Williams, they returned to Hamburg. This time, the Beatles were ready for it. They played the Top 10 Club. It was bigger than most and not as rough. Jerry and the Pacemakers, their friends from Liverpool, were also booked into the club, and all had a great time.
Yeah, 'cause I'm searching, oh, searching, oh my goodness, searching, way to way, yeah, yeah, but I'm like that northwest mountain, you know I'll bring her something, oh.
It was on this trip to Hamburg that the so-called Beatle hairstyle was born. A lot of the young men in Europe of this period wore their hair this way, especially the art college crowd. The stories of Astrid persuading Stuart to comb his hair forward were true, but she didn't get the rest of them to do it. Paul has his own story.
We saw some guy in Hamburg whose hair we liked. John and I were hitchhiking to Paris. We asked him to cut our hair like he did his. He didn't do it quite the same as his, and it fell down in a Beatles cut. He was a great guy called Jürgen. He's a photographer friend of everyone's from Hamburg.
So with the exception of Pete Best, this famous Beatle trademark was born. And when the Beatles became big in North America, it was all attributed to them. On this second trip, they made their first real recording. This time, they were to do the musical backing for Tony Sheridan. The late Bert Kaempfert, the German orchestra leader and composer of many big international hits, produced the recording. The Beatles were called the Beat Boys because the Polydor record people thought that Beatles was too confusing and that Beat Boys was always the name of Tony's backup band. Stuart was now painting and drawing more than ever before, so at this point Stuart Sutcliffe left the Beatles. It was the best thing for him. He loved the Beatles, but he was no musician, and he knew it. So Paul took over the duties of playing bass, something he really didn't want to do.
So there was a kind of changeover, and he handed over to me, and he lent me his bass, and I had to play that upside down because he didn't want the strings turned over and messed around too much. You know, I managed that. And then eventually I got my own bass, and I was kind of in on bass. So I was always like a frustrated guitarist playing bass.
Though they supposedly recorded 5 of their own numbers, only one was issued, Cry for a Shadow. It was sarcastically called this because of their disdain for the very popular Shadows, the backing group of Cliff Richard, who put out piles of instrumental hits in Britain. Written by George and John, it featured George on lead guitar and John on rhythm. John sang lead on one number. When the Beatles became big in America, it was released as a single by Polydor.
Oh, ain't she sweet? We'll see you walking down that street. Yes, I ask you very confidentially. Ain't she sweet? Oh, ain't she nice? Well, look her over once or twice. Yes, I ask you very confidentially. Ain't she nice? Just cast an eye in her direction. Oh, me, oh, my. Ain't that perfection? Oh, I repeat. Well, don't you think that's kind of neat? Yes, I ask you very confidentially. Ain't she sweet? Oh, ain't she sweet? We'll see you walking down that street. Well, I ask you very confidentially. Ain't she sweet? Oh, ain't that nice? We'll look it over once or twice. Yes, I ask you very confidentially. Ain't she nice? Just cast an eye in her direction. Oh, me, oh, my. Ain't that perfection?
Another piece the Beatles recorded with Tony Sheridan was certainly the most historic. This is the song that was requested in Brian Epstein's store 5 months later, which supposedly started his involvement with them. Tony Sheridan remembers the session.
The lineup on this session was Paul on bass, George and John on guitars, George electric, and myself on guitar and vocals. And Stuart Sutcliffe had already left then, but he was present as a friend, as an observer or something. And Pete Best on drums, of course. Oh, yeah, we can't forget Pete Best on drums. And the result of the session were a few little ditties, the best known of which, I suppose, is My Bonnie.
In July 1961, the Beatles returned to Merseyside. Before leaving, they'd made some arrangements to do some further dates at the Star Club later that year and again in 1962. Back in Liverpool, they started to play the Cavern a lot more than before, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week at night and almost every lunchtime. Liz Hughes gives us an impression of their performance.
Trying to tell you about the atmosphere is impossible. Can't do that. It was absolutely unbelievable because there was this electric atmosphere of all these kids sort of... It was the start, if you like, of like hysteria. The first time it had ever been known in Britain. You know, they were raw, completely sort of nobody had manipulated them or fashioned them in any way. It was completely raw. They were so different from the run-of-the-mill groups around at the time in sort of suede collared jackets. And these 4 lads just came on in anything. Whatever they happened to get up in that morning, they played in, you know, that day. And people would be shouting, you know, play this, play that. And they'd answer you back. They'd shout off the stage, you know, oh, shut up. Or, you know, or they say, oh, yeah, okay, in a minute sort of thing. And they were always very free.
Bob Willard, the Cavern's DJ, got hold of the single My Bonnie from George Harrison and played it incessantly, pushing everyone to buy it. Meanwhile, the beat movement in Liverpool was becoming bigger and bigger, and even inspired its own newspaper, the Mersey Beat. Bill Harry explains.
I got the inception, the idea to start it in 1960, and I started getting all the information together in notebooks and everything to work it all out, and I discovered there were so many venues and so many groups nobody ever knew, and I got together with Bob Wooler, and he made a list. I got him to make a list of all the groups he knew, and I eventually published it in Mersey Beat, and found there were over 350 groups that we knew of in Liverpool. And we thought, well, there couldn't be as many groups, you know, even in London or anything. The scene was definitely unique. We knew that.
At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, August 28, 1961, an 18-year-old boy called Raymond Jones, wearing jeans and a black leather jacket, walked into a record store at Whitechapel, Liverpool, and asked for the record My Bonnie. Behind the counter at the time was the manager of the store, Brian Epstein.
We were asked, or I was asked, by a young boy for a record by a group by the Beatles. And it always had been our policy in records to look after whatever request was made. And I followed up this inquiry. I didn't know anything about it. And it was only after a week or two that he told me that they were, in fact, a Liverpool group. I assumed, for some reason, that they were from Germany. Anyway, he told me that they were a Liverpool group and that they'd just, in fact, returned from Germany and that they were playing in a club called the Cavern, about 100 yards away from my office. And I arranged to go down there, and I saw them one midday session.
Brian Epstein was 27. He was enigmatic, artistic, and demanded quality in all things. His life to this point had been unexciting, often disappointing. So far, he'd been a successful furniture salesman, a failed soldier, a successful record salesman, a failed actor, a successful store executive, and at this time in his life was bored and looking for something new to concentrate on. So when he heard about this exciting new group, he was anxious to know more about it. But this might not have been the first time he had heard of the Beatles, as Bill Harry explains.
When I started Merseybeat came out with the first issue, I asked to see the manager of NEMS in Liverpool, who happened to be Brian Epstein, who knew nothing about the scene at the time. I showed him the copies of Merseybeat, had a meeting with him, and he agreed to take a dozen copies. The next day he phoned me, he'd sold out within an hour of taking them. He ordered 12 dozen, sold them out within a day, and then used to ask me to have chats with him 2 or 3 times a week about this burgeoning scene in Liverpool. He's very interested in it. And in fact, on issue number 1 of Merseybeat, we had the story of the origin of the Beatles, which John had written for me. On issue number 2, we had the whole front cover of the Beatles about the record they made with Bert Kaempfert in Germany. And it's interesting to note that according to Brian's book, A Cellar Full of Noise, it was 6 months later when this young chap entered his store and asked for a record by the Beatles. He wondered who they were. He found out they were from Liverpool and decided to find out about them. Well, of course, he'd known all about them 6 months before because he used to discuss the paper with me and, in fact, requested, and I let him have his own record review column every issue of the paper.
Although he may have already heard of them, it appears that one of the first times Brian saw them was at the lunchtime session at the Cavern on November 9th. From his book, A Cellar Full of Noise, Brian describes his first encounter at the Cavern. I arrived at the greasy steps leading to the vast cellar and descended gingerly past a surging crowd of Beat fans to a desk where a large man sat examining membership cards. He knew my name and nodded to an opening in the wall which led into the central of the 3 tunnels which make up the rambling cavern. Inside the club, it was black as a deep grave, dank and damp and smelly, and I regretted my decision to come. I started to talk to one of the girls. "Hush," she hissed. "The Beatles are going on now." And there, on a platform at the end of the cellar middle tunnel, stood the 4 boys. I eased myself towards the stage, past rapt young faces and jiggling bodies, and for the first time I saw the Beatles properly. They were not very tidy and not very clean, but they were tidier and cleaner than anyone else who performed at that lunchtime session, or for that matter, at most of the sessions I later attended.
We used to do lunchtime dates, so we just get up and go down to the Cavern and play from probably about 12 noon till about 2. And it was very casual, you know. We just have our tea and sandwiches and cigarettes on stage and just sing a couple of tunes and tell a few jokes. And there's something that he liked about all that, but at the same time he was trying to push us to bigger audience.
Never in Brian's mind had he thought of managing an artist or representing one, and he never knew what made him say to this eccentric group of boys that he thought a further meeting would be helpful to them and himself. But something must have sparked between them, because they arranged a meeting at the Whitechapel store at 4:30 p.m. on December 3rd, 1961, just for a chat. In the intervening days, the NEMS record store sold over 100 copies of My Bonnie after Brian had arranged for the records to be sent from Germany. When Brian arrived at the appointed time of 4:30 on December 3rd at his office, he was met by 3 Beatles and Bob Wooler, the DJ at the Cavern. Brian asked George, "Where's Paul?" It was pointless to talk any sort of terms without the whole group. George called Paul and came back to tell Brian that Paul was in the bath. Brian said, "This is disgraceful. He's going to be very late." And George replied with a smile, "Late but very clean." When Paul arrived, they went out to have a coffee, and Brian found out that they had no management or guidance beyond their own instincts. They had a manager, Alan Williams, but the Beatles had angered him when he didn't receive his commissions for their last trip to Hamburg. Eventually, after a few meetings and discussions with his lawyers, Brian became their manager, taking 25%. Brian said he needed the extra 5% as it would entail many expenses for months to come. Alistair Taylor, Brian's assistant at the time, describes the signing.
Well, we called the boys in to the office on a famous celebratory occasion, and I was called in to witness this first contract of the Beatles and Brian Epstein, which I duly did. I signed it in 5 places, and it was quite a long time afterwards when Brian wrote his book and photostated the original contract that although I signed it 5 times, there were only 4 signatures, so I witnessed a non-existent signature because Brian never did sign that contract, ever.
Brian's most immediate work was to get the Beatles more money for their performances, and in general to improve their organization, appearance, and presentation.
I encouraged them at first to get out of leather jackets and jeans, and I wouldn't allow them to appear in jeans after a short time. And then after that step, I got them to wear, I think, sweaters on stage. And then, very reluctantly, eventually suits.
Brian was convinced that the key to success for his new group was to get them a recording contract. But they were already under contract to Polydor. Bill Harry explains.
And he got a call from Brian Epstein, who'd found, when he signed the Beatles, that they'd already been contracted to 3 years with Bert Camford. And he'd put the proposal to Bert Camford, what do I need to do to, get you to release them from the contract? Obviously thinking he'd have to pay or whatever. And so Bert said at the time, he sort of wasn't sure. He liked the group, but his bosses were Polydor. So he went to Polydor and said, well, I've had an inquiry about the group, what do we do? And they said, well, look, the lead singer's all we care about, Tony Sheridan, blow the group, So he thought, if that's how they feel, and he wrote to Brian Epstein saying, yes, you can have the Beatles, we're not really interested, they keep Tony Sheridan. So he released the Beatles to Brian Epstein from the 3-year contract for nothing, absolutely nothing.
After Brian got the release from Bert Kempfert, he approached the Liverpool representative of Decca, and through him managed to get Mike Smith of the A&R department up to Liverpool to hear the Beatles at the Cavern. Mike thought that the Beatles were tremendous, and this made Brian very excited. They secured an audition at Decca on New Year's Day 1962, and at 11 a.m. on January 1st, they arrived at the studio in London. They taped several numbers and then returned to Liverpool to wait the results. Here's what they sounded like.
My tears are falling 'cause you've taken her away, and though it really hurts me so, there's something that I gotta say. Take good care of my baby, please don't ever make her blue. Just tell her that you love her, make sure you're thinking of her in everything you say and do. Take good care of my baby, now don't you ever make her cry. Just let your love surround her, paint rainbow all around her, don't let her see a cloudy sky. Once upon a time, that little girl was mine. If I had been two, I know she'd never be with you. So take good care of my baby, be just as kind as you can be. And if you should discover that you don't really love her, just send my baby back home to just as kind as you can be. And if you should discover that you don't really love her, just send my baby back home to me. Oh, take good care of my baby. Take good care of my baby. Take good care of my baby.
The Beatles doing Bobby V's hit. They also recorded a Lennon and McCartney song as well.
Hello, little girl. Hello, little girl. Hello, little girl. When I see you every day, I say, hello, little girl. When you're passing on your way, I say, hello, little girl. When I see you passing by, I cry, hello, little girl. When I try to catch your eye, I cry, hello, little girl. I send you flowers, but you don't care. You never seem to see me standing there. I often wonder what you're thinking of. I hope it's me, love, love, love. So I hope there'll come a day when you say, you're my little girl. It's not the first time that it's happened to me. It's been a long, lonely time. And it's so funny to see that I'm about to lose my mind. So I hope there'll come a day when you say, you're my little girl. You're my little girl. You're my little girl. Oh yeah. You're my little girl.
They recorded 3 original Lennon and McCartney pieces plus 8 other numbers. Dick Rowe at Decca told Brian that they didn't like the boys' sound and that groups of 4 guitarists are on the way out. Brian replied, "You must be out of your mind. These boys are going to explode. I am completely confident that one day they'll be bigger than Elvis Presley." Brian was also told by them, "You have a good record business in Liverpool, Mr. Epstein. Stick to that." Brian was rejected by Pi and EMI as well. It's been said that these companies turned away $25 to $60 million for their disinterest. When Brian returned to Lime Street Station in Liverpool, he called the Beatles for a little chat. Over lots of tea and cigarettes, he gave them the bad news. John picked up a teaspoon and flicked it into the air and shouted, "We don't care, they're fools." And, "Where are we going, fellas?" And the rest would shout, "To the top, Johnny." And he would reply, "What top?" And all would shout, "To the toppermost of the poppermost, Johnny." On January 4th, Merseybeat newspaper names the Beatles the top group in a popularity poll. On April 5th, 1962, the Beatles fan club gives a farewell party for them at the Cavern, and they leave for Hamburg to open the Star Club. The news of Stu Sutcliffe's death on their arrival stuns them. Back in Liverpool, Brian tells his father that he's going to London with the tapes for one all-out success or failure attack on the remaining record companies. His first visit in London was the HMV Record Centre on Oxford Street. Brian had decided to make the tapes into records, which were more convenient for people to listen to. The technician making the discs said he really liked the sound of the band and told a publisher who had an office upstairs. His name was Sid Coleman, and he too thought the tapes were very exciting. He said that he'd speak to a friend of his who was A&R director at Parlophone Records, a man named George Martin, who he felt would be very interested in hearing them. The next day, Brian met George Martin.
He was a typical sort of northern young entrepreneur, if you know what I mean. He was well-spoken and well-mannered and so on, and obviously had a burning faith in these boys, and he was obviously determined that they were going to be successful, no matter what I did with them. He just gave you that impression, and he was undoubtedly a tremendous influence in making them a hit.
As the discs were played, Brian sat with a face like stone, as if his very life was at stake. George commented that he knew very little about beat groups, but said that there was something good going on.
I wasn't terribly knocked out by it. In fact, I thought it was not very good. But there was some undefinable quality of rawness, of kind of, I suppose, something that was I hadn't heard before that I thought might be useful to investigate. And anyway, I was looking for a new act, to be honest, so that I was ready for something. And when I suggested that Brian brought them down for a recording test. Now, that wasn't a great decision, quite honestly, because I couldn't lose by it. It meant these poor fellows had to travel down from Liverpool, spend an afternoon with me in the studio, which I was quite prepared to do, to find out how they ticked.
Brian and George Martin arranged a demo session at EMI in London for June 6th, and Brian returned to Liverpool to be greeted at Lime Street Station by the four of them. They celebrated at the National Milk Bar, where they got drunk with Power, Coca-Cola, and 4 packets of biscuits. They planned a wild future of hit records and world tours and ticker-tape parades in every foreign capital. Unbelievably, it all came true. When George Martin met the Beatles, he liked them immediately. The most impressive thing was their engaging personalities.
When we did meet on that occasion, well, it was just love at first sight. I thought they were super. It wasn't a question of what they could do, because they hadn't written anything that was great at that time. But they had great personalities. They had a great way with them, and they charmed themselves to me a great deal. They knew that I was a guy who made all the Peter Sellers records, and they were great fans. John and George and Paul. Pete Best, who was also part of the group, was very much the background boy. He didn't say much at all. He just looked moody and sullen in the corner. And George, I suppose, was probably the most vociferous of the lot. But they were all very good.
Engineer on the session, Norman Smith, explains.
After the sound recording test, was that we took them up into the control room, George Martin and I, and we then spoke to them about the what was expected. After this laying down the law, he said to them, well, you've sat there very patiently listening to us. Is there anything at all that you want to say to us? And there was a silence. And it was George Harrison, strangely enough, that broke this silence that went on for some little time after the, flashing glances to one another, and just simply said, yeah. This is to George Martin, addressed himself to George Martin. Yeah, he says, I don't like your tie.
When the Beatles and Brian left the Abbey Road studios at EMI, there was still no contract, but they were full of hope. They flew again to Hamburg and a further performance on the Reeperbahn, and Brian went back to his record store in Liverpool. In July, George Martin had made up his mind to sign up the Beatles. Brian sent cables to all of the boys in Germany. EMI contract signed, sealed. Tremendous importance to all of us. Wonderful. In August, Pete Best is asked to leave the Beatles by Brian Epstein. The Beatles, especially George and Paul, were not happy with his drumming. They thought him a loner and too conventional to be a Beatle. To top things off, George Martin had told Brian at the end of their audition test in London that Pete wasn't good enough.
What happened was that after the first sessions that I tried out with them in the middle of 1962, I decided that Pete wasn't a very good drummer and wasn't going to make my life very easy in making good records. So I went to Brian and I said, look, I appreciate the problem I'm going to give you, but there's no reason why, to the public, Pete Best shouldn't be part of the group, but as far as records are concerned, he's out. I can get a very good drummer in, and that's the way we're going to make records. Well, I didn't realize, I learned later, that the boys had been thinking of getting rid of him anyway. And I guess my decision kind of sealed it.
The man who took over on the drums was their old friend from Liverpool and Hamburg, Richard Starkey, stage name Ringo Starr. With gold cowboy boots, a gray streak in his hair, and a desperado's thin mustache and beard, Ringo was playing at a Butlins holiday camp when the call came.
Brian Epstein phoned me up and said, would you like to join the Beatles, He said, well, he phoned me up on a Tuesday and said, would you join the Beatles? I said, yeah. He said, well, can you get home tonight? And I said, I can't leave the other group just like that, Must give a bit of notice, so I said, I'll be there Saturday.
Savage fans of Pete's hounded and yelled for Pete during Ringo's first performances with the Beatles. The change in personnel, however, hardly changed their status as Mersey's favorite beat group. On August 23, 1962, John married his girlfriend, Cynthia Powell, at a quiet ceremony in a Liverpool registry office. The marriage was kept from their fans, even Ringo. At long last, on September 11th, George Martin brought the Beatles down to London's Abbey Road studios to make their first record. From their material, George Martin picked Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You.
I was convinced I had a hit group on my hands if only I could get the right songs. And couldn't find anything better, so I reluctantly agreed to release Love Me Do as a first one.
The song Love Me Do was written mostly by Paul. Peggy Lee had just released a record called P.S. I Love You, so to avoid confusion, Love Me Do would be the better A-side. George Martin had not expected Ringo, and so had another studio drummer, Andy White, ready to play the session. Engineer on the session, Norman Smith, explains.
He was a terribly shy and reticent type of chap. It might have been because of that maybe he didn't, feel that he could do the sort of drumming that was required, or he wasn't too confident about it anyway. So we brought in a session drummer for Love Me Do.
After about 17 takes, they had it. They did versions with and without Ringo. They eventually used Ringo's drumming on the single in Britain and Canada, but the Andy White version with Ringo playing tambourine was issued on their first album and later around the world.
Love me do, oh, love me do. Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Oh, love me do. Love me do, oh, love me do. Love me do, oh, love me do, yeah, love me do, oh, love me do.
Love Me Do, their first single, was released on the 5th of October, 1962. John's harmonica gives the piece a unique feel. In the early 50s and 60s, most records by new artists in Britain were covers of U.S. hits. To release a pair of self-composed numbers seemed either daring or unwise. Using their newly acquired Gibson acoustics bought at Hessey's Music Store in Liverpool, they awaited to astound the world. But nothing happened, at least yet. The B-side is mostly written by Paul. Ringo plays only maracas, and Andy White plays the drums. The subtle chord changes and Latin rhythm gives this piece its distinctive feel.
As I write this letter, send my love to you. Remember that I'll always be in love with you. Treasure these few words till we're together. Keep all my love forever. P.S. I love you. I'll be P.S. I love you. As I write this letter, send my love to you. Remember that I'll always be in love with you. Treasure these few words till we're together. Keep all my love forever. P.S. I love you. As I write this letter, oh, send my love to you. You know I want you to remember that I'll always, be in love with you. I'll be coming home again to you, love, until the day I do, love. P.S. I love you.
The first airplay of their single was on Radio Luxembourg late one night. George Harrison said that when he heard the opening chords, he went shivery all over. Ringo says it was an exciting time for all of them.
That was like the most incredible scene, that we had a record out, that we had a bit of plastic with us on.
It slipped into the pop music papers of London quickly near the bottom of the charts. The highest it ever got was 17, but in Liverpool, it went to the top.